So as mentioned before, Matt Rockloff will be here to speak to us about loot boxes. I'd like to introduce and welcome Matt Rockloff, Professor Matthew Rockloff to be formal. He has a PhD in psychology from Florida Atlantic University, which sounds very exotic. He is the head of the Experimental Gambling Research Laboratory at Central Queensland University. I went through and had a look at his CV on the website just out of interest, and I've noted that he's been honoured as a Jack Walker Scholar, whatever that might be, because I'm not familiar with that, and twice he's been honoured as an Oral B. Newell Fellow. He's also been named as an Ig Nobel laureate in 2017, and this is for his experiments on how contact with a live crocodile affects a person's willingness to gamble, which is very interesting. I had a look through at his publications on this website, on the CV on the website, and I stopped counting. I went no further back than 2015 because there was just too many to trawl through. But I did note in that up to 2015, from 2015 till about now, I counted at least 20 reports for various agencies. And of those, there are about 5 or 6 where he was either lead author or lead researcher or on the panel of researchers for the foundation. So amongst those, there's the most recent Victorian population health study, which is really important for us in the foundation. He's done work on effects of wagering inducements on vulnerable adults. He's worked on the social cost of gambling to Victoria. He's worked on mobile EGMs and how EGM environments contribute to excessive consumption and harm. And then I looked through his published manuscripts in peer-reviewed journals, and as I said, I counted about 54 up to 2015, and I went no further than that. Matt is on holidays at the moment, and he's kindly agreed to do this presentation, so we're very thankful for that, because we're interrupting your hard-earned holidays, and we are appreciative of that, and we're looking forward to learning more about loot boxes. So thank you, Matthew. Over to you.
Thank you, Rosa, and thank you, Mark. Welcome everyone, and thanks for spending some time with us to talk about loot boxes. Hopefully we had a little introduction about what loot boxes are, but we'll talk a little bit more about what loot boxes are all about, because just in case you aren't a video gamer, a lot of people, including adults, are now video gamers. That's a pretty particularly for young people, a pretty prevalent use of entertainment time, even over television. And in fact, video games are by much larger than cinema movies in terms of overall revenue. I think several times now what they are in terms of revenue. So it's a very important thing that not only young people take part in. And the question is whether there are risks associated with some aspects of video games. And we'll only talk about one aspect. There's, of course, internet addiction, which has been recognized recently by and gaming addiction, which has been recognized by the World Health Organization as a mental health issue. But certainly we're going to talk about a particular form that really intersects with gambling and gambling problems. So I'm going to try and share my screen here, and this is always a bit complicated with several screens. So we'll see how I go, and let's get here. Screen 2. We'll try to share that. Okay. Hopefully you can see that.
We can, Matt.
Okay, great. Thank you. So that's unfortunate. It's kind of off to my side here, so I'm going to be looking to the side all the time, which I don't like to do. So I'll move my screen a little bit there. Okay, so first I wanted to recognize the funders, which was New South Wales Responsible Gambling Fund. This was an open call for research ideas. Of course, they had areas of which they wanted research done, but this was actually an original proposal by our research team at Central Queensland University under the auspices of the Experimental Gambling Research Laboratory, which I head at the university. I have a list of prestigious co-authors here. One of them, at least one of them, I noticed is actually with us, Nancy Greer. is actually in the audience. I don't think the others are in the audience, but they can identify themselves if they wish to. They're important contributors to the research, and so deserve that recognition. So we covered this at the very beginning, but I think it's worth talking about what are loot boxes, because not everybody will be familiar with them. It's a virtual box or container that you get in video games that can be opened to reveal specific items. Usually they're what are called skins, which are visual enhancements to video game characters most often. So they'll make your character look a little bit better or different from what the standard character will look like, the sort of hero or avatar that you're playing within the game. Typically you open one of these boxes and you get, as this diagram shows, several different skins that you can apply to your character and make them look a little bit special. Most often these don't confer any extra play abilities. That is, they don't change the behavior of the character or make them more powerful in any way. Although in a minority case, they may. So some parts of skins may actually have abilities attached. More often, there are other loot box prizes that are special abilities or weapons that actually may confer gameplay ability. People don't like the concept of play to win, or pay to win rather, which is where you purchase items on a store and it makes you more powerful in the game. People have tried that in video game industry, and generally players don't like that sort of thing. So skins are a good way of giving the player something that often can be purchased, but doesn't actually change the mechanics of the game, and therefore doesn't necessarily interfere with skill being the most important element in a game, if that's what people desire. Some of these items you open them and they could be a box, but they aren't necessarily a box. They could be a llama, they could be all sorts of different things. They're sometimes called loot crates, and sometimes they look like crates rather than boxes. But the idea is that it's a virtual container that actually allows you to unpack these items. Now, the important part is that you can use them in multiple play sessions, because you'll see in a lot of video games there are things that are called power-ups, and they may even look like boxes. So the power-ups are things that items that you actually achieve within the game, and then those items will give you special abilities or maybe a different look. But that will only exist within the context of a single play session, and then in the next play session, those are gone again. So it can get a little confusing as to what a loot box is, because power-ups often look like loot boxes, but are not persistent. And that ownership quality is really important, because the contents of an unpacked loot box are things that you own and you can use in future sessions of play, and therefore they have value that exists outside of the single session of play, and that has important properties that we'll unpack and to use a phrase in a moment. So why loot boxes? Why do they exist? Well, there's a number of different things that are sort of good about loot boxes, and a good can be defined in terms of the consumer, or defined in terms of the publisher, the game publisher, who's actually trying to make money off of their creations. So one of the things about loot boxes is that they're a technique of bundling, and bundling is something you'd probably be familiar with. Because I think a good example of that is seen in bundling that we're all familiar with. Netflix, for instance, is a service that a lot of people will be familiar with, that you pay a fixed price, $11 if you want the basic package, and you get access to an entire bundle, of a very large bundle of different movies and TV shows that all come in one price, a monthly subscription price. But that's not the only way things can be done. And in fact, other services like Telstra TV, or I have here Google Play Movies and TV, you can actually purchase individual movies. Which one's better? It's sort of hard to say, and it really depends on the kind of consumer you are. But you know, the Google Play or similar services, you might spend $6 for a movie versus Netflix and get one movie, one rental, one time. Whereas Netflix, you're paying $11, but you're getting you know, an almost infinite, certainly unwatchable amount of content within the same time period for a little bit more. And so in this context, you can see, well, this is probably a pretty good deal, and why is Netflix is so popular. That is that it allows bundling of a bunch of different things. Some of the things that you'll find on Telstra TV or Google Play are actually quote unquote free on Netflix. So, you know, you're paying $6 or you're paying nothing within the context of paying that monthly fee. So it can be good for consumers, and it often is, and probably most often is good for consumers. It's not always, though. So you can think of, you know, it depends on your circumstance, but if you're looking at Foxtel, for instance, they have different packages, and they might have a package that includes sports, and you're not interested in sports. But in order to get the historical movies that you like, you have to purchase the package with the sports, and you're getting maybe not as much value if you could just purchase things individually. Or maybe you don't watch movies a lot, and you just watch one or two movies, you know, a month. Then paying that higher price is something that's actually good. So most often loot boxes have that character. It has that character in two senses. You unpack a loot box and you get a number of different items, usually randomly determined or quasi-randomly determined. The randomness is hidden from the player. It may not be entirely random. But also you have, if you're looking for, you know, a certain item or a certain set of items, you can make multiple purchases, and you get bundles of different goods, and you may value some of the things that you get maybe at less than the thing that you were searching for, but you could get some, you know, interesting items and things that you value from that purchase that justify the amount of cost that you're spending over a period of time where you're making multiple loot box purchases. Another part of loot boxes is that's beneficial to the publishers and not to the consumer is obfuscation of price, which means hiding. And a good example of this is Sealy mattresses, or any mattress company of the major mattress companies. You'll go in, and if you want to buy a mattress, you'll find a Sealy mattress with a special name in a Harvey Norman and a different name in another store. But it's actually the same mattress, but they don't let you know that it's the same mattress. So you have a queen size and it has one name on one store, and it's the exact same mattress, but they rename it in a different store. And they do that on purpose to make it difficult to compare prices, because there are a number of different queen size Sealy mattresses, but you don't know if you're looking at the same product in the two stores. And so you don't know, you can't really shop on price for mattresses for the same rate. And in the same way, loot boxes obscure the price, and they do a really good job of obscuring the price of a desired item, a skin that you actually want. You want your character to look a particular way. Well, you have to make a number of different loot box purchases in the hopes that one of those loot boxes contains the character that you have. And you may even know, and sometimes they give you, sometimes they don't give you the chances that you'll win that particular skin or have that particular skin with any loot box. But it makes it very difficult to know how many purchases you have to make before you'll achieve that item, or if you'll ever reasonably achieve getting that item. So it makes the actual price of the item that you want very obscure and hard to know what that price actually is, which means that they can extract more money from the consumer, which is bad for consumers. The positive value that mainly accrues to consumers is the entertainment value of unboxing. I don't know if you've seen or you're aware of unboxing videos on YouTube. It's a phenomenon, particularly with young people. I don't get it, but people unbox items, you know, like Apple Watches and things like that. They take them out of the box, and it's part of the consumer experience is sort of discovering what is wrapped up in this box that you have, and that excitement of discovery is actually part of the entertainment value that you're actually purchasing. It's not just what the items in the box; it's actually the fun and entertainment of saying, "Hey, what am I going to get?" And in fact, that's very like gambling, isn't it? I mean, you place a bet, and the excitement comes in the anticipation of, am I going to win or am I not going to win? Of how much am I going to win? That's actually an entertainment value, and that's principally in gambling what you're actually paying for. You're paying for that excitement of not knowing what the outcome is actually going to be. Okay, so this gives us the question of, well, should we worry about loot boxes, and why should we worry if we should worry? Well, so video games have addictive properties, as I mentioned, that can lead to excessive time and money spent on the games. And so video games themselves, independent of gambling, have these addictive properties that for some people lead them into trouble. Too much time spent on the games, too much money spent on the games, and resulting in harm to themselves or their family or others. So it's just an enhancement to video games that may make them more attractive and may lead people into spending more time on the games. In-game prizes obtained from loot boxes also comprise a virtual currency, that is a thing of value, and this sort of makes it more like a gambling product that transforms the purchase into a largely unregulated gambling product. We're going to talk a little bit about what the features of and how different types of engagement with loot boxes make it more and more like a gambling product in a moment. But when you get these items, it's like owning anything else. You own a skin. A skin can be valuable. Some skins can be worth, it's rare, but they can be worth thousands of dollars. If you trade them out and sell them on to somebody else, so these are real things. They're virtual things, but they're real things in terms of the value that they represent to consumers. How can loot boxes be problematic? Well, they can be, in and of themselves, they can be problematic if people spend too much money on them, and it is quite possible to spend a large amount of money on these loot boxes. But also a second way that they can be harmful is if they serve potentially as a gateway to greater involvement in other forms of gambling. So because they're like gambling and people perceive them, part of our survey, although I don't present the results here, actually show that people recognize that loot boxes are like gambling. They serve as a gateway potentially to involvement in other forms of gambling. So if, particularly as a young person, you get involved in loot boxes and get the excitement of unboxing and not knowing what you're going to get, and potentially trading out these other items to try and get better items, or to gamble again on buying new loot box purchases, then presumably you may see this and go, this is like gambling. I really enjoy this. Maybe I'll enjoy other forms of gambling as well. Poker machine play, betting on sports, betting on esports even might be something that appeals to me. That's just a conjecture, but that's something that we want to test within this paradigm. So to start this off, what we wanted to do is figure out, well, this can only really be a problem if a lot of the games out there actually have loot boxes. So the scope of the problem is defined by whether this is a very niche sort of activity or whether loot boxes are actually a thing and common in video games. We also wanted to know sort of an independent look of being able to understand how many people play games with loot boxes in them, because sometimes people play games that have loot boxes. They don't really interact with the loot box element of the game, and they may not even be aware that there are loot boxes in there. So we want to be able to have a way of being able to see how many people play quote unquote loot box games, but not just ask them, hey, what games do you play with loot boxes in them? Because people may not be aware or may not remember which games actually have loot boxes in it, because it's only part of the experience of playing the video game, and therefore people may not have good knowledge of it. So we did an environmental scan by looking at several different sources of top selling or top money producing video games in Australia. Probably wouldn't be a lot different if we did it in the United States or Canada or elsewhere, because the video game industry is really a global industry. There are some differences in that, as you might imagine, cricket-based video games sell pretty well in Australia and don't sell all that well in the United States. And gridiron football, for instance, sells better in the United States, but largely they're the same games. So we looked at both international sources for top selling games, but also local paid for market research sources to find what are the best selling video games, and then by revenue. And we counted which of those actually contained loot boxes, which is not an easy task, but that's part of what Nancy Greer does, went and figured out all of the games and which ones had loot boxes and which ones didn't. And we found that of the top selling games that we surveyed, 62% of them had loot boxes in them. Of those games that had loot boxes, 30 or 59% allowed those loot boxes to be purchased. So sometimes loot boxes are given to in the game for free. It's just sort of a fun part of the game. You achieve something in the game. You go to the next level and you're given a loot box, and then you open the loot box and it gives you skins. So there's no additional purchase required. It's just part of the game mechanics. But some loot boxes, and in fact 60% of loot boxes, allow you to purchase them by first purchasing in-game currency. That's the most common way, and then purchasing loot boxes with this in-game currency. It's all very complicated because sometimes you can get in-game currency for game achievements and things like that, not just purchasing it. So often it's mixed together. Lastly, 84% of the games with loot boxes allowed the skins or other items to be sold for cash or traded for other items of monetary value. That is, getting other skins or other in-game currency as part of selling it back. Now, it turns out that even a larger percentage of these loot box items that you get can actually be transferred into cash simply by selling your game account. So although relatively few people do this, you can actually sell your password and your game account login details on some third-party websites and actually transform an entire game account into cash, and then use that cash for whatever you want, including for future loot box purchases. So regardless of whether it's the intention of the game developers to do this, it is actually in most cases quite possible to cash out your loot box purchases for more cash that can be used for further loot box purchases. Okay, so now we're getting to the core, which is the survey portion of this research, where we surveyed online nearly 2,000 persons in New South Wales aged 12 to 24. We chose those that age range, and we'll divide in the results the difference between adults 18 to 24 and children 12 to 17, or adolescents 12 to 17. And we chose those two groups because they're probably the key groups in terms of looking at risk. We know that people who are younger are more often more prone to gambling problems. That's one thing. That people who are younger often play video games. That's true as well, although now that video games are very popular amongst older adults as well. But in particular, we're interested in the adolescents because the adolescents could potentially aren't allowed to gamble on most forms of gambling legally, and the young adults 18 to 24 are able to newly to gamble for the first time. And so, and they probably, because loot boxes have been really popular for the last only 10 years or so, they probably had some experience of loot boxes in adolescence, which may have led on to their current gambling. So we wanted to choose those groups for that reason. Using a checkbox of all those games that we discovered that have loot boxes in them, we found that 93% of our respondents had played at least one game with a loot box in it within the last 12 months. 77% said they were aware of the presence of loot boxes in video games. So you can see a smaller percentage were actually aware. And only a slightly smaller number reported that they actually opened a loot box within a game in the last 12 months. So loot boxes, long and short of it, loot boxes are very common. Only about a third of people who had played the games with loot boxes said they had also purchased a loot box. So purchasing loot boxes with your own money is a little bit less common. And of people who obtained a loot box rewards in games, only about 7% had sold some of these rewards for cash. And that's an important part of the relationship of loot boxes to video games, as we'll see in a moment, in terms of people's engagement. So here's the moment. It arrived in terms of understanding the tiered involvement in loot boxes. And I say tiered involvement because each of these different behaviors makes loot boxes closer and closer to looking like a gambling product. So in the first instance, opening loot boxes, unboxing, which you may have been given for free, but it's a random reward, and that's very much like gambling, which is you have something and you're not really sure what the value of it is until the game is played, or in this case, the loot box is opened up. I should say loot boxes. You'll see that they have in the gaming sphere, they have a very close association with things like trading cards, which also come in packs, and you don't know what's in the pack until you unpack it. So there's a physical representation in trading cards and Yu-Gi-Oh cards and things like that your children may be interested in. And so that's part of that random reward schedule is what makes it look a bit like gambling. But if you're giving it for free, well, then you're not risking anything. You're just, you know, except for maybe the original purchase of the game, but that's kind of a long bow. The second is purchasing. When you purchase a loot box, a smaller number purchase them, then you're actually putting your money at risk for a random reward. Something of uncertain value, and that's you know almost the definition of a gambling product, right? So technically, within Australian law, loot boxes haven't been determined to be a gambling product, but that's only by agreement, because you know you do have to purchase something, and then you're putting your money at risk for something that you don't know the value of. There's always some value. You'll never unpack a loot box that is empty, right? And so in that way, they're like trading cards. You always have something in your trading card pack, but certainly you're putting your money at risk for something that unpacking a box that may have a whole bunch of things that are not valuable to you. So there's the risk involved. And the last behavioral element that makes loot boxes more like gambling is when you sell the items that you contain in the loot box, which provides you a bank of funds for potential reinvestment of winnings. And this reinvestment of winnings is one of the principal ways that gambling is harmful, particularly for poker machine gambling. So we've done some research in the past that shows that when people win at poker machines, they don't actually walk away from poker machines with more money than people who don't win, which doesn't make any sense until you realize that when people win money at a poker machine, what they do is they play longer until they lose that money. So it's really the reinvestment that creates the risk for for greater gambling involvement and harm, because you can take funds that you won and then reinvest it in gambling and eventually lose. So that's an important part. Each of these different behaviors shows that loot boxes can be progressively more like gambling depending on which you take part in. So here are some of the key results I apologize for the detail, but the detail turns out the devil's in the details, particularly in this project. It just happened to be a little bit complicated in terms of what the results were. But this is a table just for adults. So now we're just looking at people who are 18 to 24 and seeing what the results are. And I divided it by subgroup, as you can see in the first column there, of men versus women, because it turns out that there is some differentiation between men and women in terms of how they interact with these products, which is not surprising, although the results, as we'll talk about, are surprising. What I want you to look at is those red parts that I've circled there. And in those red parts, I'm looking at in the first circled column, 12-month gambling frequency. So if you bought or sold loot boxes within the last 12 months, regardless of whether you're men or women, there is a correlation between buying and selling loot boxes and whether you've gambled and the frequency with which you've gambled in the last 12 months. And a positive correlation there. I should note that we've adjusted here for age, because even though we're looking at just 18 to 24 years olds, you know, that there can be some differentiation by age because there are potential cohort effects with when loot boxes were introduced and that sort of thing. So we essentially controlled for that or regressed it out before looking at these results. We've also adjusted for multiple comparisons because there's lots of comparisons here. We used home both for any adjustments to make sure that these are, rigid-edge, really significant results. And so, yes, people who either did the more intense, and remember, buying and selling loot boxes just sort of makes it look more like gambling. Actually, those same people are gambling more often. They're also more likely to have gambling problems. So that's that second red circle there. Significantly more likely to have problems, with one exception, even though I haven't circled it, with one exception, buying and selling loot boxes is also associated with having gambling harm. The one exception is women who sold loot boxes not having substantially more harm. It could be just that there are small numbers there, and it's probably just an anomaly. Now looking at another key finding from these results is that circled blue, which is looking at women who opened loot boxes. So women who opened loot boxes were more likely to gamble frequently, spend more on gambling, have more gambling problems, and have gambling-related harm. So there's a particular, and this is just opening. It doesn't necessarily mean that they bought or sold those loot boxes. They just open them. Women who are involved in opening loot boxes are more likely to have all these items of gambling harm associated with that. Now I'm going to look at the relationship with this is just for children or adolescents, 12 to 24. Now, in this case, we didn't actually ask them about their gambling behavior because I was concerned about the ethics of asking them about their illegal behavior if they were gambling on things. We did ask about their gambling problems, however. And an interesting pattern emerged, again, with females, in this case, girls. So girls who opened, bought, or sold loot boxes were more likely to have current gambling problems in adolescence. It has to be measured a slightly different way from adults because obviously they don't have their own source of income, so the questions have to be different. We used a different scale to measure it, but nonetheless, all of those different factors of loot boxes loot box behaviors are associated with gambling problems. The other thing that we did is we wanted to look at, and I didn't mention this before because it didn't come out significant amongst the adults, but we also looked at the relationship between how long you've had exposure to loot boxes and whether you had gambling problems. And this is important because potentially, as I mentioned at the beginning, it could be that loot boxes is an impetus to being interested in other forms of gambling. So in other words, loot boxes can come potentially first, And then you go, hey, loot boxes are really for me. Maybe I'd enjoy gambling. And then you get involved in gambling and you end up experiencing gambling problems. And so we looked at the number of years since you first opened a loot box, and also the number of years since you first bought a loot box. This is how many years in the past each of these things happened, controlling for age again. And what we found was really counter to what we expected, which is, and this is only true of girls who open the loot boxes, they were more likely to open a loot box in the first instance somewhat recently rather than somewhat in the past. So it's a negative correlation rather than positive correlation. Well, what interpretation can be made of this? Well, it's hard to know, really, except that it's likely that when people open loot boxes, that it's around the same time that they are experiencing the gambling problems for the first time. And in fact, it may go the other way around, which is you're interested in gambling, and then you realize, hey, there's this thing called loot boxes. It's a lot like the activity I enjoy, gambling. And then you get involved in loot boxes for that. That's only speculative at this point, but that's one possible interpretation to make of these results. And so that is really basically what I had for you today. If you want more information, you can actually look at the report itself and go to our Facebook page for all sorts of interesting gambling related stuff to be interested in. And I will try to stop sharing. It's hard because I love to share, but there we go.
Thanks very much for that, Matt. That was a fascinating talk. We've just had a couple of questions that have come in just now. So firstly, were there any particular games that stood out when you got these figures?
Any particular games? Well, we didn't look at it, the results that we had by game. I don't know if Nancy remembers. I hate to put her on the spot, but you can not answer if you don't remember. But yeah, it's basically there are some games that are more popular than others in terms of loot box, both their popularity of the game itself and the popularity of using loot boxes within the game. But I don't recall the specific games that use loot boxes. Nancy, do you remember it all? I don't know if she's still there.
I don't recall because I wasn't a part of the data collection, like the survey aspect.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Analysis.
Just the analysis. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, don't have that one, but
No, cool.
I think it's in there though. A bit broken down by at least popularity of.
It is in the report. It's broken down by popularity.
By
so we can't look at the results in terms of, hey, is this game contributing to these results, because the correlations are rather low and it wouldn't be just one game. People play a lot of games. That's another part of it. And this is actually similar to the phenomena that you find with gambling itself, is that you can say, one of the issues that we all know is that EGMs are one of the most dangerous forms of gambling, and there's all sorts of associative evidence for that. But one of the issues is that people who play EGMs gamble on other products as well. Most often Keno, but they may have sports betting and things like that. It's very rare for somebody particularly somebody who's an intense gambler and a person with gambling problems, to play only one type of game, and therefore it becomes hard to associate harm with one particular form, even in gambling. We do know EGMs are the most harmful in Australia, but that's after a lot of work. and a lot of it's extraordinarily popular and prevalent form of gambling. Video games are much more diffuse, so even if we could look at that, we couldn't statistically assign the harm with one particular game. People like games for different reasons. People like action games and different games for different all sorts of different reasons. And it's a very, very diffuse set of games. Again, we came up with, I can't remember what it was, but nearly 100 games that were the top selling games, and that only that was by not even close to the number of games that actually have loot boxes in them.
Yeah, and within those 100 games, it was more like 300 games because one game might have 20 games in the series.
That's right. Yeah. So
Some with
FIFA.
loot boxes, some without, some with different features.
Yeah. It was a mess.
Okay. So good one here. So aside from correlations with other types of gambling, we're interested in harm from loot boxes. So key factors that make gambling dangerous are how much you can spend, how fast you can lose, and how frequently you can lose. So how do loot boxes score on these factors?
Well, we looked at the expenditure, and the expenditure on loot boxes in this survey was something like $70 a month for adults. This is on average, and $50 for the adolescents. But this is a non-representative sample, and so in a more recent and more representative sample in youth gambling project that we did, completely different project, not specifically about loot boxes per se. We did ask a question on loot boxes, and what we did is we sent out flyers to all. Well, we tried to all people in New South Wales, all households that accept flyers. Some people don't. No junk mail signs, so we couldn't send them to those. But we basically sent it to everybody in New South Wales. Our person who was doing the mail deliveries was a bit dodgy, and we're doubtful whether they actually sent them to every household, frankly. But they sent them to a lot of households, and so it was probably reasonably random sample of households within New South Wales. And we got back the results from that, and we looked at loot box expenditure, and loot box expenditure was, instead of $50, I think it was something closer to like $5 a month amongst youth. So it's like our estimate, we believe, is about 10 times what the real estimate is. So the long and short of it, there will be some people who have extreme expenditures on that. But probably the expenditures themselves are not a large source of harm for most people, because it's kind of like lottery tickets. You don't generally, people don't spend a lot of money on it. And just like lottery tickets, some people just spend an enormous amount of money on lottery tickets, and some people can have harm related to lottery tickets, but it's rare. It's hard to know whether there is addictive loot box buyers out there. I imagine that there probably are amongst youth. But it doesn't seem to be the direct harm related to expenditure on loot boxes. We didn't see a lot of that, at least in our sample.
Sure. Just had a couple asking about the types of gambling that people went on to. So do we know that it went on to pokies or sports betting? Do we know about that?
Yeah, again, I think we didn't ask because of survey length, we couldn't ask the type of gambling that people would do. The results that we found that turned out to be significant because of the factor of being having many multiple comparisons were only related to adolescent girls. That is, girls between the ages of 12 and 17. There was a unexpected negative correlation, where that is, they tend to have problems with gambling if they take up loot boxes at or near or before around the same time. And so we don't know which products they migrate to in terms of what's causing them those gambling problems. But obviously it's less likely to be things like sports betting, because they're girls, that it's more likely to be things that they have access to, playing cards and things like that with friends, that sort of thing.
Sure. So one here, is there a danger in games containing loot boxes being manufactured by the same companies and game developers that manufacture EGMs?
Well, I don't know. At first, I doubt that would work very well. In terms of it's a very different thing. The thing about loot boxes is that they are only a part of the experience. The real game, if you just had a game with loot boxes and without anything else, nobody would want to be interested in it. It's really part of a larger experience of enjoying the game and being able to customize your character. The gambling companies have tried to move into the video game sphere by creating these games that have skill components. So they're skill-based gambling, and they have video games embedded into them. There's like a bubble pop one that's been I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically pop bubbles, and depending on your reaction speed, you can sort of have slightly better results than you would at random. That one's been approved in Australia. But there are other ones that are first-person shooters in the United States, where you actually look at shooting. There's a Western-themed one where you can shoot bad guys, and then again, if every shot that you take is actually a bet. So if you kill an enemy, you've made a bet. Which is kind of odd because you can actually lose on that bet. And in fact, you're more likely to lose a bet. So the faster you play and the more skillful you are at the game, actually, the faster you'll lose money on average, which is great. So it creates the impression that you're doing really well. But one of the things that you look at when you look at these games is they're pretty bad. Like, they're really not. If you compare those games to Fortnite, it's like, forget it. They are so far behind, it's ridiculous. So I wouldn't be terribly concerned about them being successful in that sphere, because it is a very different thing. The video game designers are really good at creating compelling graphics that draw people in, but the game mechanics is its own specialty, and I wouldn't be too concerned about them being successful at that.
Yep. Just on the nature of the games, we had one. I'm wondering if there was any capturing of either the advisory or restricted age ratings that the games had.
No, we did not. We did not look that. Although we do have the games themselves in the appendices. So in the appendices of the report, anybody could go back and say, and figure out what the recommended age ratings are for those. Again, since our results don't relate to individual games, they relate to the compendium of whether you've played a game or not with loot boxes in them, and we do that again because it's the only thing that's possible, because there's such a great variety of games that you couldn't relate that to knowing whether they're more at risk or not. Although I suppose you could go back in an analysis and say, and look at whether people played a game that was mature rated versus not, and relate that to gambling problems. I suppose that could be an analysis that could be done. It hasn't been done though.
Yep, sure. There's a couple more, but it's coming up towards 25 past, so I might throw it back to Mark now.
Good.
Yeah, thanks again for the talk, mate.
Thank you.
It's terrific. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. And I'm sure on behalf of the people who've attended this webinar, a big thank you to Matt for his time and many insights that you've provided. In particular, obviously, it's during your period of annual leave, so I appreciate you taking the time out. Obviously, I'm confident now, and it's such a huge area, and it's growing at such a significant speed and ever evolving. But I feel we've certainly got a greater idea about loot boxes, in particular the nature and the type and the function of them, how common they are in Australian video games, and obviously that information about age 12 to 24 who opened, bought and sold them. In particular, very insightful about the link of the tendency for females to be engaged in this and opening up the loot boxes, which was quite insightful. And obviously the potential, does loot boxes in adolescence relate to later gambling related problems, which is obviously a significant concern for us all. So really appreciate that, Matt. And thanks to the team. Thanks to